Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 13th of February, day 355, and with me to discuss the very latest military and political updates is the Telegraph's Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes and our Rome correspondent Nick Squires, calling in from Belgium and Italy, respectively. I started by asking Joe, fresh from a press conference by NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, about speculation over the weekend that Russia is struggling to launch its much-anticipated offensive in eastern Ukraine.
Good afternoon, folks. Yes, you're right. I'm just out of a press conference with NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, but more on that later. Yeah, so let's start with the start of this kind of huge, large-scale Russian offensive that we've all expected, and Ukraine's been warning about, NATO allies have been warning about. And let's be clear, it has started. So Alexei Danilov, he's the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defence Council. Over the weekend, he said Russia are having big problems with an offensive. And so I've heard from NATO intelligence officers that they believe the Russian offensive is not likely to come in one enormous push all along the front line. It will likely be in concentrated areas, small pockets of activity across parts of the front line, and it's still not exactly clear what Russia is planning, but we think they are doing something big to coincide with the one-year anniversary, which comes in about 11 days. And it's been described to me as a process rather than a single event. But I think what has become stark now is there's been a lot of warnings about the Russian tactics, and that is sort of World War I style, throwing large numbers of men at one defensive location in the hope of overwhelming them. They don't care about casualty rates. They are just basically throwing more and more men into the meat grinder. And say, following kind of Alexei Danilov's reflections, we have sort of had warnings from, well, kind of not warnings, but insight from the Ministry of Defence, Britain's Ministry of Defence, is that Russia has likely suffered its highest rate of casualties of the war so far in the past 2 weeks. And that firstly points towards an uptick in activity, which kind of signals the start of this offensive. And according to some sort of available statistics, Russia is losing up to 800 troops a day at the moment. That's a kind of a vast amount to be losing. If you're doing that over a month, 2 months, 3 months, no matter how long this offensive goes on, you can't sustain that sort of casualty rate at kind of a healthy, it's not a healthy figure to be chasing. So as we drill down into the conflict, we're actually kind of seeing a lot of that fighting is concentrated on Bakhmut, the next town that has been heavily fought over for kind of 8 or 9 months now. Russian forces seemingly over the weekend inch closer towards controlling it by taking a village on the outskirts. They took, according to Wagner, they took Krasnogora, a village on the northeastern edge of Bakhmut, or northern edge of Bakhmut, really, which kind of suggests that Russia is inching closer towards actually having a presence inside the city rather than just the occasional sort of fight there on the outskirts. So we obviously can't verify these claims. Wagner obviously take them with a pinch of salt. Ukraine says the fighting remains fierce there and has reported that Russia has hit more than 24 nearby settlements with tank rounds, mortar rounds and artillery fire. And then in another reflection that demonstrates the brutality of the fight over Donetsk, which is one half of the Donbass, which is what we believe is the likely target of the Russian offensive. We believe with Western intelligence, Ukrainian intelligence, that Russia is likely going to push towards to take the entire eastern Donbass region and fully control that. But yeah, so going back to this, citing Ukrainian military officials, they have suggested that Ukrainian forces in Volodar, which is about 100 miles southwest of Bakhmut, have destroyed an entire brigade of Russia's elite 155 naval infantry. The brigade totaled up to around 5,000 soldiers, Russian soldiers, who were either killed, wounded or captured. And they the sources quoted in this Politico piece suggest that Russia was losing between 150 and 300 troops a day in that area. And that, again, that speaks towards sort of the higher casualty rates and the higher effort that Russia is putting in to try and capture smallish towns in the Donetsk region. So the report also totaled that in the last week or so, 130 pieces of Russian hardware, including 36 tank units, had been destroyed or damaged. Elsewhere, according to Ukraine's general staff, Russia has carried out attacks on at least 7 regions: Donetsk, Kherson, Kharkiv, Sumy, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia and Luhansk over the past 24 hours, killing 4 people and injuring 3 more. According to Kherson Kherson region, the military administration. This includes the southern oblast being hit 42 times by Russian forces using multi-launch rocket systems, mortars, tanks and rockets. 3 people were killed in Kherson. Ukraine has repelled a number of Russian attacks on the southern Zaporizhia region over the last 24 hours. In this morning's Ministry of Defence intelligence briefing, they said Russia is likely bolstering its defensive lines in Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia is partly occupied by Russia. It was one of the regions that was apparently annexed as part of these Russian attempts to kind of cement control over occupied regions, but it's still very much being fought over. So British military officials wrote a major Ukrainian breakthrough in Zaporizhia would seriously challenge the viability of Russia's so-called land bridge linking Russia's Rostov region and Crimea. But then if you look at kind of what the Russian narrative is at the moment. So Russia on Monday, that's today, said its troops had pushed forward a few kilometres along the front lines in Ukraine. It said the Ministry of Defence said the Russian servicemen broke the enemy's resistance and advanced several kilometres deeper into its Ekhelon defence. So that's about 1.2 miles is the kind of estimate. So it does show that Russia is making progress in times, if you believe them, but it's very grinding progress. It's really a war of attrition. It's being fought over meters rather than miles at times. And then there's one more thing that I will conclude on, which I'd like to mention, which was over the weekend. One of our correspondents, James Kilner, wrote a piece about it you can see online, but I will shortly kind of bring it together. So over the weekend, we saw this kind of fascinating Russian attack on what is described as a key bridge in Ukraine. Video of the attack showed a kind of a boat, a vessel, speeding towards the kind of the low-lying Zatoka bridge, or it's a railway and road drawbridge near Odessa late on Friday. As this boat passes under the bridge, the boat explodes, debris fly into the water, smoke billows over. So Western analysts have warned that Russian drone boats now pose a major new threat to Ukrainian supply lines and can threaten the control of the Black Sea as a sort of weapon that's being used. We've seen one of these wash up in Crimea before, which was apparently a Ukrainian vessel. It's been suggested that they've been used by Ukraine to hit targets around Crimea and coastal kind of targets around Russia and Russian-controlled areas. So it's not a new kind of idea to be using a water-based drone to strike behind enemy lines, but I think it's fascinating to see that Russia has now employed them or deployed them as a tactic. And I will stop there for now and hand it back over to you, Francis.
Well, thank you for that very comprehensive overview, Joe. Just before I turn to the first of our major diplomatic stories today, just one question for you, which is we're talking about the unprecedented Russian casualties that we're hearing. I'm just wondering if we're getting any sense or if you've seen anything suggestive of what kind of losses the Ukrainians are suffering as a consequence of the beginning of this Russian offensive.
So that is a no. So the Ukrainians have made a concerted effort not to publish any details on casualty rates. Their Western allies have also respected that idea and have refused to speculate on how many Ukrainian casualties, but estimates have put them at the same numbers as Russians. Russia, if not a little bit lower, basically because they have fewer men on the ground and probably they are fighting from well dug in positions. But I remember being in Ukraine in October, November as the Kherson offensive raged on, and we were visiting kind of hospitals and speaking to frontline medics, and they would say that, look, we can treat between 200 and 300 patients a day, casualties on the front line at the kind of the highest rate of fighting. As they were trying to thrust in to Russian-held positions, the casualty rates would get higher. So, look, we can expect Ukraine is probably largely on the defensive at the moment, so it's probably not sustaining as many. But as soon as they start to launch counter-offensive and their own offensive operations, that number will increase. So we don't know largely the amount, but previous kind of estimates have put it at 50 to 60,000 casualties. I thought that was a fair while ago. So you can put that Ukraine is also suffering a high casualty rate, and the questions will one day arise: when will they run out of manpower to fight the Russian invasion if Vladimir Putin continues to mobilize hundreds of thousands of troops without a kind of care for their welfare and just happy to throw them into the meat grinder? One day that will come to a head.
Well, thank you, Joe. We're staying on the military theme, but shifting to the political and diplomatic space. The biggest development this morning is that Poland, of course, one of Ukraine's closest allies, has cast doubt on whether the country will get the Western fighter jets. It was seen over the weekend that actually Poland might be the country that's the first to really move on this, as opposed to Britain or France. But Poland it's actually come directly from President Duda. He told the BBC on Sunday that sending jets was a very serious decision. That's a direct quote, and not easy to take. He said that Poland didn't have enough jets to send it by itself, and noted that combat aircraft have high maintenance needs, which would pose a substantial challenge. So no doubt that is a blow to Ukraine, and that's why I'm leading on it in the diplomatic space today, because it's something we're also leading on the paper, because there's a lot of conversations happening about it as we speak. The Polish president also had a message for Vladimir Putin. He said that sooner or later it has to finish badly for him. If the Western democracies, NATO, the European Union, together with the United States, give permanent support to Ukraine, then Vladimir Putin has to lose. And sooner or later it will mean he falls. So very strong words from him. But there have been some other noteworthy remarks from European politicians over the weekend. And I want to come to Nick Squires, our Rome correspondent now. Our old friend Silvio Berlusconi, Nick, seems to have caused something of a furore in Italy by certain comments about Ukraine. What's happened?
Indeed, that's right. Good afternoon. Silvio Berlusconi, up to his old tricks, coming out with pro-Moscow and an anti-Ukraine message. This was last night in response to questions from reporters. He essentially blamed Ukraine for prolonging the war needlessly by engaging with the Russians militarily in the Donbass. And Mr. Berlusconi referred to those two regions of the Donbass as autonomous regions, so pretty much single-handedly recognizing them as Russian. He said of Mr. Zelensky, "I judge very, very negatively the behavior of this gentleman." Mr. Berlusconi suggested that the war could be brought to an end within days if the West came up with a package worth billions of euros or dollars of post-war reconstruction aid for Ukraine, but made that contingent on Ukraine pushing for an immediate ceasefire with the Russians. Now, this has caused a bit of a political storm in Italy, as you can imagine. Just to remind people, Mr. Berlusconi is the leader of a party which is in alliance, in coalition with Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister, and with another party led by Matteo Salvini. So they're all in this together, a centre-right coalition governing Italy. The Prime Minister's office had to put out a clarification within hours of Mr. Berlusconi's remarks, essentially saying, no, we're rock solid with the Western alliance and in support of Ukraine. But meanwhile, of course, opposition politicians in Italy criticising Berlusconi for what he said, saying it's irresponsible, it's extremely serious. One opposition party leader accusing him of pro-Putin ravings. And of course, Mr. Berlusconi has got form on this. He had a very close relationship with Putin for many, many years. And just back in the autumn, just before the centre-right coalition was elected, he again embarrassed Giorgia Meloni and his allies by announcing gleefully that he'd received a case of vodka as a birthday present from President Putin, and what he called a very sweet letter from Mr. Putin as well.
Yes, I remember we covered that at the time. Quite extraordinary things to say given the context. Thanks for that, Nick. Now, you've also written a detailed piece with regard to the Balkans, somewhere we've been keen to discuss more frequently on the podcast. What's the latest there?
Yeah, so I'm just back from Kosovo, from an assignment to Kosovo. And the context there is that there's been months of tension between Kosovo and Serbia, and specifically in the north of Kosovo, which is dominated by ethnic Serbs. There's about 50,000 ethnic Serbs who live in the north of Kosovo, but who very much don't recognize Kosovo as a country and would much rather be with neighbouring Serbia. There's been some violence. There's been barricades set up between Serbs and ethnic Albanian police. Shots were fired in the last month or so. Serbia at one point said it wanted to send its troops into northern Kosovo. And I went to Pristina, to the capital, to interview the president of Kosovo, Vjosa Osman. And she told me that the Kosovans believe that not only are the Serbs stirring up trouble, as they see it, but that the Serbs are now acting in league with the Wagner group, the Russian group of mercenaries. The specific allegation from the president to me was that Wagner and Serbian paramilitaries are illegally smuggling weapons and unmarked uniforms from Serbia into northern Kosovo, as apparently laying the groundwork for some sort of hybrid operation or some sort of annexation of northern Kosovo. And of course, this evokes parallels, I think, with Crimea in 2014, the famous little green men, the soldiers in unmarked uniforms who were running around and who turned out later, of course, to be Russian, and who laid the way for the Russian annexation of Crimea.
So this has the potential to be quite a big story. I mean, what is the perspective on the severity of the Russian involvement in this in terms of working with the Serbian government? I mean, is this a sort of small-scale operation, or is there actually evidence this is quite a substantive arm of what Russia wants to be doing to destabilise Europe more broadly?
Yes, well, I mean, certainly we found out in the last month or so that Wagner has started recruiting or trying to recruit Serbs for its war in Ukraine. That's something that's on the record. When I pressed the president of Kosovo a little bit more on numbers and whether any alleged Wagner mercenaries had actually come onto Kosovan territory, she said that's still under investigation. So hard to say specifically up in northern Kosovo exactly what that role is. But certainly, generally, it's been a familiar narrative for some years now, that Russia sees an easy place to destabilize in the Western Balkans. And some people would say that it uses Serbia, its longtime ally, as a proxy for those sorts of things. The president of Kosovo is saying to me, this is not just about us. This is not just Kosovo, Serbia. This is a much broader issue in the Balkans that involves Russian interference in Montenegro, in North Macedonia, and in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So her contention, and many other people, is that Russia sees in the Balkans a means to divert the West's attention from the war in Ukraine, and also to stir up so much trouble between Balkan nations that it will impede their path towards EU and NATO membership.
Thank you, Nick. Well, this is something that's really, really interesting and topical for everything that's going on at the moment. And to listeners who have not yet heard the interview that we did with Dr. Ivana Stradner, which was live, I think, a few weeks ago, I would highly recommend that. I'm sure if you do a Google search for Ukraine the Latest and her name, you'll be able to find it. It was a really interesting discussion as part of that about the disinformation efforts of the Russians in the Balkans, and it speaks to what Nick has just been talking about in a little bit more detail there. So we'll come back to Nick at the end for his final thoughts, but there are just a few other political updates that I wanted to draw attention to today. The first is there's been continuation of Zelensky sacking senior figures who may be implicated in corruption. This is part of his drive to clean up the government at this critical state of the war. We understand that he's dismissed the deputy commander of the National Guard, and this is following a brief decree issued by the presidential office as part of this initiative to clean up the government in the coming weeks and months. There's been no reasons that have been given for the move, but it was quite noticeable, I thought, the number of political figures who commented both in Brussels and in Britain on Zelensky's efforts to clean up corruption in Ukraine. Clearly, this is seen as the central pillar of Zelensky's strategy on keeping the West on side, but also an attempt to rebuild Ukraine's future and the kind of country that it wants to be. So this will be something that no doubt, again, we'll be returning to, because it does seem to be an authentic and genuine policy of the Zelensky government to clean this up. Turning away from Ukraine and looking more into Russia, however, has been quite interesting seeing that the United States this morning has told its citizens still in Russia to leave immediately amid the heightened fears of the Russian offensive in Ukraine. I'll read their statement from the embassy. US citizens residing or travelling in Russia should depart immediately. Exercise increased caution due to the risk of wrongful detentions. Do not travel to Russia. So pretty blunt remarks there, I think it's fair to say. And obviously this speaks to the concerns about what the political environment may well be in Russia if the offensive perhaps begins to falter. There may be foreign dignitaries, foreign individuals who are arrested as an attempt to detract from the offensive there. So something I speak, again, for us to remain sensitive to. Joe spoke about the Wagner Group earlier on, and there's also been another interesting development on this written again by James Kilner, who I'm sure we'll have on the podcast again soon, which is about how the Kremlin has reportedly ordered Russian propagandists not to promote Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. So apparently this is an attempt by the Kremlin to sort of censor some of the coverage that Wagner has been getting in the West. Of course, we've covered them extensively on this podcast and in our newspaper, as have many other outlets. And I think perhaps the Kremlin are becoming increasingly sensitive to the fact that this is actually doing them great reputational harm, if indeed that's the right way of thinking about it with regard to Russia. But yes, so the story is that effectively the Kremlin has been publishing this sort of guidelines really for Russian propagandists in the internet space of the kind of messaging that they want to be putting out. And of course, Wagner has been central to that in terms of the promotions that's been made on Russian Telegram channels, some of which have 500,000 subscribers or more. But there's been this deliberate initiative sent down from on high, individuals receiving direct orders from the leadership saying that essentially this should stop, this should cease, and trying to analyse as to the exact reasons why this is the case. It's believed that there's been anger within the Kremlin of the outward criticisms from individuals in the Wagner Group, particularly Prigozhin, about the Russian strategy and calling for themselves to receive more military emphasis, to give them more resources in order to be fighting. But of course, that's exactly what Russia did, and the Wagner Group has not had those huge gains, those huge successes in Bakhmut and elsewhere where they've been engaged. They've taken extensive losses, and I think this is an attempt by Moscow to reduce their influence not only in the news, the Western news analysis of the war, and obviously their brutal tactics is something we've spoken about at length, but also to, in a sense, put Wagner back in their box and to make it clear that actually this is a Russian military-led operation and not a private contractor one. So that's quite an interesting development and one we will, I'm sure, return to. But I just wanted to conclude in the political space with looking at a concerning story, which is that specialists from Russia's defense ministry are building a water pipeline that would connect the country's Rostov region bordering Ukraine with the Donbass. Now, we're hearing this from TASS, the news agency. They reported this late on Sunday night, and apparently Moscow are investing very, very heavily in this project to be completed in the next few months. Would have the capacity to carry 300,000 cubic meters of water per day and would include two 200-kilometer lines. There are apparently more than 2,600 specialists involved in this from the Russian military defense and over 1,000 units of equipment being involved around the clock in construction. But as I say, the significance is that it will pass through the territory of the Rostov region in Russia and into the Donetsk region. So why are they doing this? Well, for one, of course, it's clear that they want to have more influence in those regions and to show that they're here to stay. I think that's the biggest one. But also it does speak, I think, as well to concerns about the broader strategy of the Russian military and how they need to be accessing more specific resources, whether it be water or other things. And to touch on this, I'm very grateful to a listener who I won't name, who's a meteorologist, but has been updating me and I'm sure several other journalists on what's going on around a huge reservoir in Ukraine. And there's been some coverage on this over the weekend, so I think I can talk about it a little bit more now. It's NPR that have covered this. And it's essentially this reservoir is being emptied of water, believed to be being emptied by the Russians because it's in their controlled territory. The consequence of this is that it would imperil drinking water, agricultural production and safety at Zaporizhzhia, of course, the nuclear power plant. Now, I won't go into all of the detail of this, but in essence, water has been gushing out of this reservoir, the Kakhovka, since November 2022. And we know this due to satellite data that shows that the water level at the reservoir has plummeted to its lowest point in 3 decades. And as I say, what's at stake here is the drinking water for hundreds of thousands of residents, irrigation for nearly 500,000 acres of farmland, and perhaps most significantly, the cooling system at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Now, we don't know if that is the main motivation for this, but there is speculation that it is. The other piece of speculation is that, and this is the one I should say that's been posited by the Zaporizhzhia Regional Military Administration, is that they are draining the reservoir as part of a plan to flood the area south of the dam in an effort to keep Ukrainian forces from crossing the Dnipro River. I say it's all speculation at this stage, but of course it's a huge concern when you've got a reservoir of this size essentially flooding enormous territory. And we have, of course, numerous examples from history, as we've talked about on the podcast previously, where you have reservoirs that are broken in war, deliberately or accidentally, and the huge consequences of that, not only at the time, but also for years and years afterwards. It totally changes the landscape in ways that can take decades to recover. So we will be returning to this again, I'm sure, but I just wanted to flag it today as part of this broader conversation that we're having around Russia's attempts to cement its control of those territories that it currently does. And indeed, part of that, unfortunately, is destroying or damaging or harnessing Ukrainian infrastructure. Joe, just to return to you before we conclude today, I understand there's one more story that you wanted to discuss relating to the plan to ramp up shell production for Ukraine.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting and probably one of the most important things that we have to consider at the moment in terms of support for Ukraine. So a lot of the kind of talk and public bluster has focused around fighter jets and tanks. But when President Zelensky travelled to the UK, he went to Paris and then came on to Brussels, and his appeal for weapons, yes, it did mention tanks, it did mention fighter jets, but he and his officials really focused on the fact that they need 155 millimeter artillery shells. And as a result of that, and it's no kind of surprise or shock to many people that there is now a growing shortage of those in Europe because of what's happened in terms of support for Ukraine. And so there was an interesting sort of plan was put forward by the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, and she suggested that Europe should be rushing to launch a COVID-style plan to ramp up shell production. And this was after Volodymyr Zelensky personally was told by EU leaders in a meeting that, and this is a quote, "we don't have much in our warehouses to give you." So it's been the kind of European governments have backed this. So as we know, Germany have backed it, Sweden have backed it. I'm sure France will come on board because it has a kind of a large military industrial complex. But what Kaja Kallas is essentially proposing is that Europe adopts the same scheme that it had for COVID vaccines, where procurement efforts are centralised inside the European Commission. So experts sort of pull knowledge and finances essentially in order to place huge orders that will enable manufacturers to ramp up production. Because that's one of the problems at the moment is manufacturers in Europe and I'm sure in America and elsewhere have been told they need to ramp up production of artillery shells and other weapons to support Ukraine and to replenish stocks inside the West. But as far as we can tell, not many countries have placed orders, which is basically these firms have said, well, if you're not going to place orders, we will not risk spending the money to increase our production capabilities. So Kaja Kallas basically said, look, if we can get the Commission to start placing orders, and the Commission placed orders for billions and billions of coronavirus jabs, and that enabled vaccine producers to ramp up their production as a result. And she's saying the same thing could be used to push for artillery. So obviously there's no guarantee. I've received a lot of emails and messages from Eurosceptics over the weeks or over the days and hours since the story was published. It's published in the Sunday Telegraph, and they were saying, "Oh, but hang on, the EU's coronavirus vaccine rollout was very slow." And yes, that was right as of the start. Once they'd started or stopped fighting with Britain over kind of our rollout and decided that they should focus efforts on trying to convince manufacturers to ramp up production, it actually went very successfully. And at certain points, Germany was giving out over 1 million jabs a day, which kind of was a huge number and a huge success, considering the amount of kind of people they have in their country. But there's a few other warnings. Yes, that is one thing that needs doing, but also NATO is also trying to engage with industry to convince them to ramp up production. So Jens Stoltenberg today in the press conference I was in, he warned that delivery times of certain high caliber ammunition have increased to 28 months, and that was up from 12 months previously. And he has warned and said the NATO alliance is in a race of logistics against Russia to get crucial supplies to Ukraine. And some of the figures that kind of intelligence people have told me over the last few days is Ukraine fires 6,000 artillery shells a day. Russia fires 20,000 artillery shells a day. The current production capacity of European kind of artillery shell production is 20,000 shells a month. So what Russia is firing in a day is being produced in Europe in a month. So supplies are literally dwindling. The current rate of ammunition consumption is higher and bigger than the current rate of production. So we can't sustain Ukraine, and we can't make sure that we are able to protect ourselves if we carry on like that. So Kaja Kallas's idea of kind of having one centralised group of European countries, it could include Britain. So British officials have spoken out and said, you know what, that could work. It's a good idea, and anything that helps Ukraine is a good thing, as long as it doesn't interrupt with other kind of international efforts at NATO or other platforms. It's a good thing. So basically, they're saying that, look, we can create a pool of funds to place an order big enough for shells that will convince manufacturers to up their production rate, and that's quite crucial. And I'll stop there because I know we're kind of running short on time.
We are, Joe. Thanks for that. Just one more question, if I could, to you. You obviously were in that conference with Jens Stoltenberg before we came on air. Just wondering if there were any other insights that came out of that.
So Jens Stoltenberg, interestingly, he acknowledged the threat that Chinese weather balloons have posed to the alliance, not just in the US and Canada, but also in Europe, where there have been reports of not sightings, but some sort of activity over the last few years. He again sort of said back on support for Ukraine, he didn't rule out fighter jets, but kind of he skirted around the idea of them being given and said, look, it takes time, and what we need to do now is sort of do things very quickly, because he says speed saves lives, which goes against the normal speed kills road traffic accident adverts that we see and warnings. And he also acknowledged that the start of the counteroffensive has happened, and he didn't say it was all in one kind of massive go, but he alluded to there has been an uptick in activity and an uptick in the disregard Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin has for its troops that have been sent to Ukraine, kind of alluding to that idea that Russia is willing to send its men to the death in the hope of overwhelming Ukrainian positions. But largely, he spoke out more in support of Ukraine. He said NATO allies should do more, and he said that is protecting Ukraine also protects us in NATO. And then he also devoted a fairly large of his time to the earthquake in Turkey and said that NATO support is coming to Turkey, and that is important because he's currently engaged in sort of a diplomatic wrangling over Turkey letting in Finland and Sweden to become the 31st and the 32nd allies in the NATO alliance. So that's important kind of wording and context there on that. But that's pretty much what he had to say ahead of tomorrow. There is a Ramstein meeting, one of the US-led meetings on support for Ukraine in Brussels. That's going to involve NATO defence ministers plus more, and then NATO defence ministers are going to get together to discuss Ukraine, and then more sort of individual issues such as the defence and deterrence that they have to ensure the protection of the NATO alliance. So that's to come tomorrow, and I will be in Brussels and at NATO HQ, so maybe I might jump on if there is space for me.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. And of course, we will talk more about China and these balloons in due course the next time that we want to talk about them in the context of Ukraine. I think it's really interesting what you were talking about Turkey as well. There's been a lot of speculation I was reading over the weekend about what the impact of this terrible, terrible earthquake could be on Turkish politics. Of course, Erdogan came to power as a consequence of an earthquake 20 years ago. It sort of totally destroyed the credibility of the then government, and Erdogan benefited from that. And the question is whether in these elections in May, assuming they go ahead, they may not because it's a state of emergency, whether there will be electoral implications for President Erdogan. But nonetheless, regardless to what you were saying, Joe, the impact of this from regard to the West and their dealings with Turkey have been quite considerably affected by this. I mean, President Erdogan was consistently, prior to the elections, trying to sort of stoke up anti-Western sentiment within the country because he knows that plays well electorally, and we've already spoken about that in the past. But now, of course, he is relying on that Western support, the financial support, the support in terms of the emergency relief efforts to try and rescue people from buildings. And so this will have consequences. And I think that, you know, if he was looking to Russia for support, he's not got any. And that might be something that will have impacts on the question of Sweden and Finland becoming members of NATO in due course. Who knows what kind of conversations are happening behind closed doors? And one could argue that a vulnerable Erdogan is something that actually the West can use to leverage things in the coming months. But of course, at the moment, the main concern is just rescuing as many people as possible and helping as many people as possible who have gone through this terrible tragedy. I think it's now upwards of 35,000 people have been killed in Turkey. I mean, just extraordinary high numbers. But anyway, we've run out of time today, so just want to come to you both for your final thoughts. Nick, what do you want to end our listeners with today?
I'd just like to add, I suppose, on these warnings of some sort of hybrid military action against Kosovo or annexation by Serbia. The big difference, of course, between Kosovo and Crimea is that Kosovo has a NATO presence. KFOR, or Kosovo Force, has been in the country for more than 20 years. There are British troops and American troops and many other nationalities serving with them. So that is a huge difference between Kosovo now and Crimea in 2004. And just finally, also to point out that Serbia is very keen, or says it's keen, to join the European Union. And I think that will also act as a brake on its actions.